I was supposed to be out there for just a few hours. Just a simple hike, nothing too far, nothing too difficult. I had checked the weather, packed some food and water, and made sure my phone was charged. It wasn't my first time hiking alone, and it wasn't anything I hadn't done before. The trail was about 6 miles out and back, winding through thick forest before leading up to an exposed ridgeline with a great view of the valley below. It wasn't well traveled, but it was marked well enough, and I figured I could be back at my car before dark. The first few miles were peaceful. The forest was quiet, aside from the occasional chirping birds and rustling leaves. Sunlight filtered through the trees, casting shifting patterns on the dirt path. The air smelled like damp earth and pine, and I took deep breaths as I walked. I kept a steady pace, enjoying the rhythm of my footsteps. The sound of gravel crunching beneath my boots was oddly comforting. I'd always liked hiking alone. No distractions, no noise except for nature, no need to keep up with anyone but myself. It was around mile 3 that I noticed something odd. A single boot print in the dirt. It wasn't mine. It was fresher than any tracks I had left behind, and it was facing the same direction I was heading. But I hadn't seen or heard anyone on the trail. I stopped and looked around. The trees stood still. No wind, no movement, just silence. I brushed it off. Someone must have been ahead of me, maybe taking a break off the trail where I couldn't see them. I kept walking. A half-mile later, I found another footprint, then another. They were spaced irregularly, like whoever had left them wasn't walking at a normal pace, like they were limping or staggering. The hairs on my arms stood up, but I kept going. At the 4-mile mark, the trees thinned out, giving way to the rocky ridgeline. I stepped carefully, testing my footing before putting my full weight down. The drop-off on one side was steep, sharp rocks lining the bottom. I reached the highest point and paused to take in the view. The valley stretched far below, thick with green trees. In the distance, I could see the outline of the road I'd driven in on. I took a sip of water and pulled out a protein bar. Then I saw movement. Down the trail, maybe 100 yards away, something shifted near the trees. It was fast, too fast for an animal that size. I squinted, trying to focus, but the shadows made it hard to tell. Person? Maybe, but they weren't moving like a hiker. They were low to the ground, almost crawling. A sudden chill crawled up my spine. I wasn't alone. I turned back toward the trail I'd come from, ready to head back, but something stopped me. Another footprint, right where I had been standing minutes ago. The dirt was still settling around the edges. I hadn't heard a single sound. My stomach dropped. Someone was following me, stepping exactly where I had stepped, staying just out of sight. I didn't run. Running could be a mistake. Running could make me careless, could make noise, could make whoever was out there know that I knew. I walked, steady, controlled, my breathing forced into even patterns. I listened. Every few steps, I paused for just half a second, just long enough to see if I could hear anything behind me. Nothing. But that didn't mean nothing was there. The sun was starting to dip lower. I needed to get back before dark. I pushed forward, faster now, my boots hitting the dirt harder than before. Then I heard it, a soft shuffle behind me. I froze. The trees were thick on either side of the trail. I couldn't see anything past them. The wind had picked up just slightly, rustling the leaves enough that I couldn't pinpoint the sound. I waited. Nothing. Slowly, I started moving again. One step, another. Then something darted across the trail behind me. I spun around so fast I almost lost my footing. Nothing. But I knew I had seen something. A shape, a figure, something just on the edge of my vision. I turned back around and kept moving. I didn't stop again. By the time I reached the last mile, my hands were shaking. My legs burned from moving so fast, but I didn't slow down. The sun had dipped even lower, and the sky was turning that deep shade of orange that meant I had maybe 20 minutes of light left. Then I saw it. A figure standing just off the trail, half hidden behind a tree. It was close, too close. I could see the outline of its shoulders, its arms, its head tilted slightly like it was watching me. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. Then it took a step forward. I turned and ran. My boots hit the dirt hard. My breath came fast. My heart hammered against my ribs. The trail blurred under my feet, the trees whipping past me. I didn't care if I made noise now. I didn't care if I fell. I just needed to get to my car. I could hear movement behind me. Fast, unsteady footsteps. I didn't look back. When I reached the parking lot, my car was the only one there. I yanked the door open, jumped inside, and slammed the lock down. Silence. I looked up. Nothing. Just the empty trailhead. I sat there for a long time, my hands clenched around the steering wheel, my breath shaking. I never saw a face. I never saw who or what was out there, but I never went back. I set out early, just after sunrise, with the plan to hike deep into the backcountry alone. I had done plenty of solo hikes before, so I wasn't nervous. I was careful, methodical. I packed enough food for 3 days, extra water, a good knife, a small first aid kit, a compass, and a printed map, even though my GPS was fully charged. I wasn't reckless. The trail was one I had researched for weeks, an old logging route deep in a national forest. It wasn't a well-known trail, which was part of the appeal. I wanted solitude, a break from everything. My life had been stressful lately, and I just needed to be alone in the quiet. The first part of the hike was beautiful. The air was crisp, the smell of pine thick, and the occasional sound of birds chirping filled the air. The trail wound through dense trees, some parts narrow and overgrown, but nothing too bad. I followed the markers on my map, double-checking with my GPS to make sure I was on track. About 5 miles in, I reached a split in the trail. My map showed one path leading to an old fire lookout, the other deeper into the forest toward a stream where I planned to set up camp. The fire lookout was tempting, but I stuck with my plan. I turned right and followed the path toward the stream. About an hour later, I noticed something off. The trail was getting narrower, more overgrown than I expected. My map didn't indicate this should be a problem, but it was clear that no one had been through here in a long time. Bushes clawed at my legs, and I had to push through thick undergrowth. It was annoying, but not dangerous. Still, it put me on edge. Then I saw the first sign that something was wrong. A boot, a single old hiking boot lying just off the trail. It looked like it had been there for a while, covered in dirt, half buried in leaves. It wasn't torn up or anything, just there, out of place. I stopped, looking around. The forest was still, too still. No birds, no rustling of small animals, just silence. The air felt heavier. I tried to shake it off and kept going, stepping over fallen branches and trying not to let my mind wander. An hour later, I reached the stream. It was wider than I expected, the water flowing fast, clear and cold. I found a good flat spot to set up camp, dropped my pack, and started getting things ready. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees, but there was nothing, just thick woods and the stream rushing past. By nightfall, I had a small fire going. I ate my food, sat back, and tried to enjoy the quiet, but that feeling never left. Stayed with me, crawling under my skin. I kept listening for something. Footsteps, breathing, anything. But all I heard was the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl far off in the distance. When I finally crawled into my sleeping bag, I kept my knife close. I don't know why. I told myself I was being paranoid. The forest at night always feels different. Sounds carry differently, Your mind plays tricks on you. But I knew I wouldn't sleep easy. Then, just past midnight, I heard it. A branch snapping. Close. I held my breath, listening. The fire had burned down to embers, barely giving off any light. I slowly reached for my flashlight, careful not to make a sound, and clicked it on. Nothing, just trees and darkness. The underbrush swayed slightly in the breeze, but nothing else moved. I turned off the light, lay back down, and forced myself to close my eyes. It was probably an animal, a deer maybe, just my mind making things worse than they were. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I woke up to a noise that made my stomach drop. Breathing, heavy, slow breathing, right outside my tent. My body went rigid. I didn't move. I barely even breathed myself. The sound was deep, steady, like someone just standing there, inhaling and exhaling slowly. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would give me away. I reached for my knife, gripping it so tight my hand hurt. The breathing continued for what felt like an eternity. Then it stopped. Silence. But the kind of silence that felt loaded, like something was waiting. I stayed like that, frozen, until the first hints of dawn. Only when the birds started singing again did I dare move. When I unzipped my tent, my gut twisted. Footprints. Large, deep footprints in the dirt right outside my tent. They weren't boot prints. They were bare feet. Human. I packed up fast, heart hammering, barely stopping to eat. I had planned to stay another night, but there was no way. I needed to get out of there. The hike back was brutal. Every snapped twig, every shadow made my pulse jump. I kept checking over my shoulder, expecting to see something, someone, following me, but I saw nothing. It wasn't until I was almost back to the trailhead that I found the second boot. A different one this time. Same old, dirty, half-buried look. I didn't stop to think about it. I just kept walking. I don't know who was out there with me that night. I don't know if they were watching me the whole time, if they were just passing through, or if they had planned to do something worse. But I do know one thing. I won't ever hike alone again. I always loved hiking alone. It gave me a sense of freedom, a break from the noise of life. The woods didn't judge, didn't demand anything from me. It was just me, my boots against the dirt, and the quiet world around me. That's why, when I had a long weekend, I planned a solo trip deep into the national forest near my home. It wasn't a well-known trail, but I'd found it a year ago while exploring. The path was overgrown in places, but I liked that about it. Felt untouched, like stepping into a different world. I packed light but smart, a tent, food, plenty of water, my knife, a fire starter, and a map. The first day was uneventful. The weather was perfect, cool, crisp air with the sun filtering through the trees. The hike was tough in some spots, but I welcomed the challenge. By late afternoon, I reached a small clearing near a creek and set up camp. I ate, listened to the wind rustling the trees, and fell asleep to the sound of running water. Sometime in the night, I woke up. Something wasn't right. At first, I thought it was just the normal sounds of the woods. An animal moving in the brush, a branch snapping. But then I noticed it wasn't random. The noises were coming from one spot, steady, close, like someone standing just beyond my tent, shifting their weight. I lay still, listening. My hand found my knife. I held my breath. The noise stopped. A long, silent moment passed, and then I heard it, soft but deliberate, breathing, just outside the thin fabric of my tent. I didn't move. My mind raced through possibilities. A bear? A coyote? Person? I hadn't seen another soul on the trail all day. I should have called out, but something told me not to. I just waited. Minutes passed. Nothing. Then, slowly, I reached for my flashlight. I clicked it on and unzipped the tent in one quick motion. My light cut through the darkness. Nothing. The woods were empty. The trees swayed gently. The creek bubbled in the background. My heart pounded in my ears. I stayed like that for a while, scanning the darkness, before finally zipping the tent back up. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe it was just the wind. I barely slept. The next morning, I packed up and moved deeper into the woods. I told myself it was just paranoia, that I was overreacting. But as I walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The trees felt different now, closer, watching. By late afternoon, I found another good spot to camp, an open area with a view of a small valley. I set up, ate, and tried to shake the uneasy feeling that had been clinging to me all day. Then I saw them, footprints, not mine, fresh, leading up to my campsite, then stopping near a tree about 20 feet away. The prints were deep, like someone had stood there for a long time. Watching, my stomach dropped. I looked around, scanning the trees, but there was no one. I wasn't alone. I forced myself to stay calm. I had a knife, I had a fire. I wasn't defenseless. I decided to stay awake as long as I could. Hours passed. The fire crackled. The woods were silent. Too silent. Normally, there were always sounds, crickets, owls, something. But now, nothing. Just stillness. Then I heard it again. The breathing. Closer this time. I gripped my knife, every muscle in my body tense. I wanted to yell, to run, to do something, but fear pinned me in place. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the breathing stopped. I didn't sleep. I kept the fire going all night. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I packed up and left. Fast. I didn't care about the trail anymore. I just moved, putting as much distance between me and that place as possible. I walked for hours, barely stopping to drink water. The forest was thick, and I had to check my map often, but I kept moving. My legs ached. My back throbbed under the weight of my pack. But I didn't stop. Couldn't. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. A shirt, hanging from a tree branch. My shirt. The extra one I had packed, the one that had been in my bag. But my bag had been zipped. Hadn't it? I stared at it, my heart hammering. Someone had been in my camp. Someone had gone through my things. Panic set in. I took off, half running now, crashing through the undergrowth. My only goal was to get out. And then I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. Behind me. Fast. I ran. Branches tore at my skin. My pack felt like dead weight. But I ran. The sound of footsteps stayed close, never gaining, never falling behind. Just there. I don't know how long I ran. Time blurred. The forest thinned. And then suddenly I saw it, the road. My car. I didn't stop. I ripped open the door, threw my pack inside, and locked every door. My hands fumbled for the keys. When the engine roared to life, I slammed the gas. I didn't look back. I drove straight home, heart pounding the entire way. I never reported it. What would I say? That I heard breathing? That someone left footprints? That my shirt had been hanging in a tree? Maybe it was a warning. Maybe it was a game. I don't know, but I do know this. I will never hike alone again. I parked my truck at the trailhead just after sunrise, the early morning mist still clinging to the trees. The drive out had been uneventful, just miles of empty highway and winding forest roads. I'd planned this solo hike for weeks. 3 days alone in the wilderness, just me, my pack, and the trail. I wasn't new to hiking, but this was the most remote trip I'd ever done. No cell service, no nearby towns, just hundreds of acres of unspoiled forest. That's exactly what I wanted. The first few miles were easy, just a gentle incline through thick pines. The trail was well marked, and the air was crisp, filled with the scent of damp earth and pine needles. I took my time, stopping occasionally to adjust my pack or take in the view. Around noon, I reached a clearing with a fallen log, perfect for a break. I pulled out a protein bar and my map, checking my route. The plan was simple. Hike about 12 miles today, set up camp near a small stream, then continue deeper into the wilderness the next morning. By mid-afternoon, the trail changed. The pines gave way to a denser, darker section of forest, the kind where sunlight barely touched the ground. The air was different here, heavier, and the sounds of birds and rustling leaves seemed muted. I shook off the unease. It was just my mind playing tricks. But as I walked, I noticed something odd. There were no footprints. This trail was supposed to be used by other hikers, at least occasionally, but the dirt was untouched. No signs of recent travel. An hour later, I reached the stream where I planned to camp. The water was clear, cold, and perfect for filtering. I set up my tent, gathered some firewood, and settled in for the evening. The quiet was unsettling. I was used to the sounds of the forest, but this place felt too still. As darkness fell, I forced myself to relax. A fire crackled in front of me, and I ate my freeze-dried meal in silence. Then, just as I was finishing my food, I heard it. A single, sharp snap of a branch, not far off in the trees behind me. I froze, staring into the darkness. My fire cast flickering shadows, making it impossible to see beyond a few feet. I held my breath, listening. Nothing. Probably an animal, I told myself. Maybe a deer. Still, I kept my headlamp on and stayed alert. The night passed slowly. Every rustling leaf, every distant sound made my heart pound. But nothing came close. By dawn, I felt foolish for how tense I'd been. I packed up and continued hiking. The trail grew steeper, the forest thicker. I kept an eye out for trail markers, but they became fewer and farther between. By early afternoon, I realized I hadn't seen a marker in over an hour. I checked my map and compass, trying to figure out where I went wrong. That's when I found the footprints. Not mine. They were old, barely visible in the dirt, but they were there. A single set, leading off the main trail and disappearing into the trees. I crouched down, studying them. They were deep. Whoever left them was carrying something heavy. A bad feeling crept up my spine. I should have turned back, but instead I followed them. Just for a few minutes, I told myself, just to see. The tracks led to a clearing. At first, it looked normal, just trees and underbrush. But then I saw the remnants of a fire pit, old and long cold. Nearby, a small pile of bones. Animal, I assumed. Then my eyes caught something else. A strip of faded fabric, tangled in the undergrowth. It looked like part of a backpack. Something was wrong. I backed away, retracing my steps to the main trail. My gut screamed at me to get out of there. I hiked fast, pushing hard to make up for lost time. But the farther I went, the more I realized I was lost. The trail was gone. I forced myself to stay calm. I had a map, a compass. I knew how to backtrack. I stopped to get my bearings, but the trees all looked the same. The sky was overcast, making it impossible to tell which direction I was heading. Then, another sound. A low, deliberate whistle. Not a bird, not the wind. A human whistle. I turned, my breath catching in my throat. The sound had come from deep in the trees, too far to see anything but close enough that whoever made it knew I was here. I didn't wait. I started moving, fast but careful. My boots crunched over leaves and twigs, my pulse pounding. The whistling came again, closer. Panic set in. I wasn't alone out here. Someone was watching me. I walked for hours, ignoring the burning in my legs, the sweat dripping down my back. No more whistles, no more sounds. But the feeling of being watched never left. By nightfall, I found a small rocky outcrop and climbed up, giving myself a vantage point. I didn't make a fire. I didn't eat. I just sat in silence, gripping my knife, waiting. Sometime in the night, I heard footsteps. Not an animal. Slow, deliberate, moving through the brush below. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The footsteps stopped. Minutes passed. Then, the sound of something being dropped onto the ground. A dull, heavy thud. I stayed awake until dawn, clutching my knife, my body rigid with fear. When the sun finally rose, I climbed down, heart hammering. I had to get out. That's when I saw it. A bundle of sticks, tied together with twine, sitting right where I'd heard the noise. And underneath it, my map. I never saw who left it. I didn't wait to find out. I grabbed my gear and ran. I didn't stop, didn't rest, didn't eat. I moved faster than I ever had in my life. It took me all day, but I finally found the road, collapsing onto the gravel in exhaustion. My truck was a mile away, but I didn't stop until I was inside, doors locked, engine roaring to life. I never reported it. What would I even say? I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know one thing for sure. Someone was watching me, and they let me leave. I always liked hiking alone. Something about being deep in the woods, away from people, the sounds of nature all around. It was peaceful. I never really felt unsafe, even in the most isolated places. I always carried a good knife, a solid understanding of my surroundings, and enough supplies to last longer than I needed. That changed last fall. I had taken time off work, deciding to tackle a long trail deep in a national forest, miles from any town. It was supposed to be a 3-day trip, nothing too extreme, but challenging enough to push myself. The weather was perfect, cool but not cold, clear skies. I had checked maps, packed carefully, and left my itinerary with a friend just in case. The first day was uneventful. I followed a narrow dirt path winding through thick trees, the kind of place where the world fades away. Just birds, the crunch of leaves underfoot, the occasional squirrel darting across the trail. I made good time, found a nice clearing to set up my tent before sundown, and settled in for the night. It wasn't until the second day that things started to feel off. I had been hiking for hours, making my way through an old-growth section of the forest. The trees were massive, their trunks covered in thick moss, the canopy so dense it made everything below feel dim. There were no sounds beyond my own movements. No birds, no rustling, just an eerie silence. I told myself it was normal. Sometimes animals go quiet, maybe sensing a predator nearby. I kept moving. Then I saw it, a set of footprints in the dirt ahead of me. They weren't mine. I had been following a narrow, lesser-used trail, and as far as I knew, no one else should be out here. But these footprints were fresh. I could see the sharp edges, the way the dirt had been pressed down just recently. They were bigger than mine, maybe a size or two up, and heading in the same direction. I paused, scanning the woods. Nothing. A weird feeling crept up my spine. It wasn't fear, not yet, but a deep unease. I wasn't alone out here. I kept walking, slower now, more aware of every sound around me. The trail twisted through thick underbrush, and the farther I went, the worse the feeling got. Then I saw something that made my stomach drop. The footprints had stopped. They didn't turn around. They didn't veer off the path. They just stopped, right in the middle of the trail, like whoever made them had vanished. I stood there for a long time, staring at that last print. The dirt around it was undisturbed. No signs of movement, no indication of where they had gone. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the ground had just been firmer ahead. Maybe the person had stepped carefully. But it didn't sit right. I kept going, forcing myself to stay calm, to focus. My knife was on my belt, My pack felt solid on my back. I had food, water, a GPS, everything I needed to be fine. Another hour passed, and I started to think I was overreacting. Maybe someone had just wandered off trail. Maybe there was a simple explanation. Then I found the campsite. It wasn't mine. A small clearing, an old fire ring, and a single collapsed tent. It looked like it had been abandoned for a while. The fabric torn, the poles snapped like someone had left in a hurry. Nearby, a few rusted cans sat half buried in leaves. A jacket draped over a low branch. And there was a smell, faint but unmistakable. Rot. I hesitated before stepping closer. Something told me to turn around, to leave, but I needed to know. The tent was empty. No signs of a sleeping bag, no personal items beyond the jacket and the cans. But the way it had been destroyed, it didn't look like weather damage. It looked deliberate. I crouched, brushing some leaves aside. Beneath them, a deep gouge in the dirt, like something had been dragged. My pulse pounded in my ears. I straightened up fast, scanning the trees. Still no sounds. No wind, no rustling. Just that heavy silence. I needed to move. I turned back toward the trail and froze. A fresh footprint, right next to mine, bigger than mine. My brain struggled to process it. I had been standing there for minutes. No one had walked past me. And yet, I didn't wait. I grabbed my pack, forced myself to stay calm, and started walking, faster this time. The next few hours were a blur. I pushed hard, moving quicker than I should have, my legs burning, my breath ragged. Every so often, I glanced back, but I never saw anyone. The feeling didn't go away. That sense of being watched followed. Every shadow looked wrong. Every rustle sent my heart racing. I kept telling myself I was imagining things, that I was just tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me. But I didn't stop. I hiked until the sun started setting, only then allowing myself a break. I found a rocky outcrop, somewhere with a clear view in all directions, and forced myself to eat, to drink, to breathe. And then, just as the last light faded, I saw it. Far down the trail where I had come from, something moved, a shape too far to make out clearly, but it was there, standing, watching. I didn't wait. I packed up, grabbed my headlamp, and kept moving. I didn't stop that night. I hiked through the dark, my headlamp cutting through the trees, my knife in my hand. Every sound made my skin crawl. I felt like a rabbit, running from something I couldn't see, but I knew was there. By the time the sky started turning gray with dawn, I saw the trailhead in the distance. My car, my escape. I didn't look back. I don't know who or what was out there. I don't know what happened at that abandoned campsite. I don't know how those footprints stopped or why I felt watched, but I haven't hiked alone since. I always liked hiking alone. It gave me time to think, clear my head, and just enjoy being away from the noise of the world. I never considered myself reckless. I always packed enough food and water, carried a first aid kit, and told someone where I was going. But no amount of preparation can account for the things you don't see coming. The trail I picked that day wasn't a popular one. It was somewhere in the mountains, far from any city. The kind of place where the trees stretched for miles, and the only sounds were birds, wind, and your own footsteps crunching against the dirt. I'd hiked it once before, years ago, but I barely remembered it. I just knew it was supposed to be about a 10-mile loop with some great views at the top. The first few miles were easy. The air was crisp, the sky clear. I saw some deer early on, watching me from the trees before darting away. Felt like a perfect day. I moved steadily uphill, taking breaks when I needed to, checking my map and GPS every so often to make sure I was on track. Around mile 4, things started to feel off. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just little things. The trail seemed narrower than I remembered, the trees closer together. I didn't recall seeing so many broken branches along the way, like something had crashed through, but I figured maybe a storm had passed through recently, or maybe I just hadn't paid attention last time. Then I noticed the silence. No birds, no wind, nothing but my own breathing. I stopped walking, stood still, listened. Sometimes the woods get quiet when a predator is nearby, but I didn't hear anything moving. Just that heavy, unnatural silence pressing in on me. It made my skin crawl. I kept going, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. At mile 6, I found the first sign that something was seriously wrong. A boot print in the dirt. Not mine. Too fresh. Too big. I knelt down, staring at it. It was deep, like whoever left it was carrying something heavy. Maybe a backpack, maybe something else. I scanned the trail ahead, trying to see if there were more, but the dirt and pine needles made it hard to tell. I told myself it was nothing, just another hiker, but I hadn't seen anyone all day, and the print was facing back the way I'd come. Someone had been here recently and they'd turned around. Why? A little farther ahead, I found out. The trail split. It wasn't supposed to. I pulled out my map, checked my GPS. There was only one path up the mountain, one path back down. But in front of me, the dirt path I'd been following veered off to the right, while a narrower, less traveled one continued straight. The new trail looked wrong. The trees were thicker around it, their branches reaching low, almost like they wanted to close over the path completely. The ground was uneven, like it hadn't been walked on much. I should have turned back, but I didn't. I don't know why. Maybe I was curious. Maybe I told myself it was just an old game trail that had been widened by animals or erosion. I took the straighter path. At first, it felt like any other trail. The silence still weighed heavy, but I kept walking, my boots crunching against the dirt. I checked my GPS again. No signal. That was normal this deep in the mountains, but it didn't help my nerves. A few minutes later, I saw something ahead. A backpack. It was sitting just off the trail, half hidden in the brush. A dark blue hiking pack, faded from sun and rain. The straps were frayed, one of the zippers broken. It looked like it had been there a while. I hesitated, then stepped closer. The contents were scattered. A torn sleeping bag, a rusted camping stove, a water bottle still half full, sitting upright like someone had placed it there and never came back for it. No wallet, no ID, no sign of who had left it behind. I looked around. The trees were too thick to see far, but I didn't hear anything. No footsteps, no breathing, just the awful, suffocating quiet. I should have left, but my stomach was twisted in knots, and my brain was screaming that something was wrong. I didn't want to be here anymore. I turned back. The trail was gone. I spun in a circle. The narrow dirt path I'd been following had vanished, swallowed by the forest. There were only trees, thick and unyielding, their trunks pressing in like a wall. I took a shaky breath. I had to have taken a wrong step, veered slightly off without realizing it. I'd find the path again. I just had to stay calm. I picked a direction and walked. 5 minutes, 10. The trees never thinned. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like I was being watched, but there was nothing, just trees stretching endlessly in every direction. Then I saw the boot print again. Same size, same depth. My own print was next to it. I'd been walking in circles. Panic clawed up my throat. My GPS still had no signal. I pulled out my compass, tried to get my bearings, but the needle spun wildly, refusing to settle. That wasn't possible. Something was messing with it. Maybe iron deposits in the ground, maybe something else, but I had no way of knowing. A branch snapped somewhere behind me. I froze. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. I didn't turn around. I wanted to. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to look. but some instinct, some primal part of me told me not to. I walked, slowly, carefully, listening. I don't know how long I moved like that. Maybe minutes, maybe an hour. But eventually, I saw something through the trees. Sunlight, open space. I ran. The trees thinned, the forest opening up, and suddenly I was back on the main trail. The real trail. I don't know how I got there. One second I was lost, the next I wasn't. But I didn't stop to question it. I walked fast, nearly jogging, my legs shaking with every step. I didn't stop until I saw my car. I jumped in, locked the doors, and drove. I didn't look back. I don't know what happened that day. I don't know whose boot print I saw, or why the trail had split when my map said it shouldn't. Maybe I was dehydrated. Maybe I panicked and got turned around. Maybe, but I've been hiking my whole life. I know how to read a map. I know how to follow a trail. And I know what I felt in those woods. I haven't gone hiking alone since. I left early in the morning, the air still cool and damp from the night before. My plan was to hike a remote trail deep in the national forest, a place I had heard about from a coworker who described it as breathtaking but challenging. It wasn't on any official maps, which made it all the more appealing. A trail that few people knew about meant solitude, and I needed that. I packed my gear carefully, plenty of water, protein bars, a first aid kit, and my knife. I wasn't expecting to use it, but it was always good to have. I told myself this was just another hike, no different from the dozens I had done before. The drive to the trailhead took nearly 2 hours. The road was rough, mostly dirt and gravel, with deep ruts that shook my truck violently as I navigated around them. By the time I reached my destination, my arms were sore from gripping the wheels so tightly. I parked in a small clearing, checking my GPS one last time. There was no signal, which didn't surprise me. That was part of the appeal. I stepped out of the truck and stretched, breathing in the fresh scent of pine and damp earth. The woods were dense, towering evergreens stretching high into the sky, their thick branches creating a canopy that filtered the morning light. It was quiet, not completely silent, but quiet in a way that made everything feel still. The only sounds were the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustling of leaves when the wind passed through. The trail started off easy, a gentle incline with firm, packed dirt beneath my boots. I fell into a rhythm quickly, my steps steady, my breathing controlled. I liked this part of hiking, when the world outside faded away and my thoughts became clearer. I walked for nearly an hour before the trail became more rugged. The incline grew steeper, and the ground became uneven, littered with roots and loose rocks. I had to focus on every step, my muscles straining as I climbed higher. At one point, I stopped to take a break, drinking from my water bottle and looking around. The trees were taller here, the light dimmer. I checked my watch just after noon. I had time to keep going. The plan was to hike to the peak, take in the view, then start my descent before dark. I had checked the forecast before leaving, and there was no sign of rain. Everything should have been fine. But then I noticed something strange. The woods were too quiet. The sounds of birds and insects had stopped. The rustling of leaves in the wind had vanished. It was a deep, unnatural silence that made the hairs on my arms stand up. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing. Maybe I had just gone so deep into the forest that there weren't as many animals around. That made sense, right? I pressed on, but that feeling of unease stayed with me. My footsteps felt louder now, every crunch of dirt and snap of twigs echoing in the stillness. I kept glancing over my shoulder, even though I knew no one was there. My pace quickened, and I told myself it was just my imagination. Then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a fallen tree up ahead, half hidden in the undergrowth. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't a tree at all. It was an old tent. The fabric was faded, covered in dirt and moss, as if it had been there for years. The poles were still standing, but barely. The entrance flap hung open, swaying slightly. I hesitated. Something about it felt wrong, but my curiosity got the best of me. I stepped closer, peering inside. There was a sleeping bag, unzipped and partially rolled up. A rusted camping stove sat beside it. There were old food wrappers, a torn backpack, and a single hiking boot covered in dried mud. But no sign of anyone. My stomach clenched. Whoever had camped here had left in a hurry, or they had never left at all. I pulled out my phone, knowing full well I had no signal, but still hoping. Nothing. I debated what to do. The logical choice was to turn around and head back. But part of me needed to know more. I scanned the ground around the tent and saw footprints. They were faint but fresh. Someone had been here recently. My pulse quickened. I wasn't alone. I turned in a slow circle, scanning the trees. I saw nothing but endless forest. But that feeling, the one that had been nagging at me for the past hour, was stronger now. I was being watched. A sound behind me made me spin around. A snap like a branch breaking underfoot. I held my breath, straining to hear more. Silence. My own heartbeat pounded in my ears. I slowly backed away from the tent, my hand gripping the knife on my belt. Then, another sound. Closer. A shuffling movement just beyond the trees. I turned and started walking back the way I came, keeping my pace steady, controlled. Running would be a mistake. Running would make me pray. The feeling of being watched didn't fade. It got worse. The sounds followed me, soft, deliberate footsteps just beyond my line of sight. I walked faster. The sun was lower now, the light fading. I had lost more time than I realized. Then the smell hit me. It was faint at first, but as I kept moving, it grew stronger. Rot, decay. Like something had died and had been left to rot in the heat. I covered my nose, trying not to gag. I wanted to look, to see where it was coming from, but some instinct deep inside me screamed not to. I didn't stop moving. The path ahead finally looked familiar. I was close to the trailhead. Relief flooded me, but I didn't slow down. Not until I was at my truck, yanking the door open and throwing myself inside. I locked the doors, started the engine, and peeled out of there so fast the tires kicked up dirt. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the main road, civilization in sight. I never found out what was in those woods. I never went back to that trail, and I never stopped wondering what would have happened if I had stayed just a little longer.